cake was perfect. 4 layers of vanilla sponge with strawberry cream, decorated with tiny handcrafted sugar roses. It sat on a linen-covered table on the sprawling back lawn of the Delgado estate, a perfect centerpiece for my daughter, Isabella's perfect first birthday party. Everything was perfect, which is how the Delgados liked it. Perfect house, perfect son, perfect image. It's a shame it was all built on a foundation of rot. I'm Angela. I'm 32, and for the last 5 years I've been married to Luis Delgado. Today, however, felt less like a celebration and more like the beginning of the end. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and my mother-in-law's expensive perfume. Regina Delgado, a woman of 58 who carried herself with the unshakable confidence of a monarch, was holding court near the French doors, a half-empty glass of Chardonnay in her hand. Her husband, Kenneth, a quiet, imposing man of 62, stood by the grill, his silence a familiar wall. My husband, Luis, who at 34 still possessed the easy charm that had first drawn me in, was mingling with guests, flashing his perfect smile. He was the golden son, the heir to the Delgado name, and the reason I was standing in this beautiful, suffocating prison. The party was winding down when Regina decided to make her move. She glided to the centre of the patio, her voice, sharpened by wine, cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation. "Oh, everyone, you simply must see this." She held up a framed photograph. It was a baby picture of Luis, his face round and serious, with a shock of dark hair. A few guests chuckled politely. "Doesn't he look just like his father?" Regina cooed, glancing at Kenneth, who gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. Then, her eyes cold and assessing, landed on me. I was holding Isabella, who was sleepily rubbing her face against my shoulder. "It's funny, isn't it?" Regina continued, her voice dropping just enough to make everyone lean in. "You look at this picture of Luis, and you see a Delgado through and through, but then you look at little Isabella." She let the sentence hang in the air, a poisonous vapour. "I just don't see the resemblance, not to Luis, anyway." The chatter stopped. The air crackled. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, on my daughter. I looked at Luis, pleading with my expression alone for him to step in, to say something, to shut this down. He met my gaze for a fraction of a second before looking away. A weak, apologetic smile plastered on his face. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous tic he'd had since I met him. In that moment, the silence wasn't just a lack of words, it was a betrayal sharper than any accusation. Regina took his silence as an invitation to escalate. "I'm just saying, Angela, that a child should look like her father. It's a simple biological fact." Her smile was a cruel slash of red lipstick, unless, of course, there's a reason she doesn't. There it was, the accusation laid bare for all their friends and family to witness. Humiliation washed over me, hot and swift. My hands trembled slightly as I held my daughter closer. This wasn't the first time Regina had implied such a thing, but it was the first time she'd done it so publicly. But then, a strange calm settled over me. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I looked up from my daughter's soft hair and met my mother-in-law's gaze. I let a small, serene smile touch my lips. The sight of it seemed to unnerve her more than tears or anger ever could. "You're right, Regina," I said, my voice even and clear. "A child should look like her father. And family transparency is so important." I paused, letting everyone absorb my agreement. Luis looked relieved, probably thinking I was about to fold. "So I agree," I continued, my smile widening. "Let's do a DNA test, for Isabella, to prove once and for all that she is Luis's daughter." A wave of shock rippled through the remaining guests. Regina's smug expression faltered for a second. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected. "In fact," I added, turning to address the whole family, my eyes sweeping over a stunned Luis and a stone-faced Kenneth, Why stop there? To ensure there are absolutely no questions about the Delgado lineage, let's make it a family-wide affair. Me, Luis, Isabella, you, Kenneth. Full transparency. Let's clear the air for good. Regina stared at me, caught in the trap of her own making. To refuse now would be to admit she was just being malicious. Her pride wouldn't allow it. After a tense moment, her smugness returned, tenfold. She thought she was calling my bluff. She thought she had me cornered. "An excellent idea, dear," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine condescension. An excellent idea indeed. She had no idea. She couldn't possibly know that I'd spent the last 6 months quietly piecing together a puzzle she and Kenneth had buried over 30 years ago. She thought this was her victory. She didn't realise she had just handed me the shovel to dig up her own grave. The last of the guests trickled out, leaving behind a graveyard of champagne flutes and crumpled napkins. The perfect cake was half-eaten, its sugar roses wilting under the evening sky. Regina stood by the fireplace, swirling the last of her wine, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had won. She saw my calm agreement as a sign of surrender, a desperate, foolish gambit. She didn't understand that her smile was the smile of the condemned, blissfully unaware of the executioner sharpening the axe. This wasn't an impulsive decision. My plan had been unfolding in silence for 6 months, ever since a rainy Tuesday afternoon spent in the dusty, neglected attic of this very house. I'd been looking for a box of old holiday decorations when I stumbled upon a heavy, leather-bound photo album. It was filled with pictures from the year before Luis was born. There was Regina, young and vibrant, standing next to Kenneth on a beach vacation. There she was, at a Christmas party, wearing a sleek, form-fitting dress. The date on the back of the photo read, December 1987. Luis was born in March of 1988. In every single picture from the months leading up to his birth, Regina was impossibly, undeniably slender. There was no baby bump, not a hint of one. I sat on the dusty floor, the smell of mothballs and old paper filling my lungs, and stared at the smiling woman in the photograph. It was a small thing, an inconsistency most people would overlook. But in a family as obsessed with its own history as the Delgados, it was a chasm. I started cross-referencing dates, looking at other photos, reading old letters. The story they told and the story the pictures showed didn't line up. That was the day the first seed of my plan was planted. Regina's constant biting remarks about my supposed inadequacies were no longer just insults. They were the desperate deflections of a woman guarding a secret. After the party, once Isabella was asleep in her crib, I locked myself in the guest bathroom and called my best friend Violet. She actually did it, I whispered into the phone, my voice tight, in front of everyone. "Angie, are you okay?" Violet's voice was a warm, steady anchor. "What did you do?" "What did Luis do?" "I agreed," I said, "and I raised the stakes, a full family test." I told her the rest. There was a long pause on the other end. "You're really going through with it, then? The whole thing?" It wasn't a question. She left me no choice, Vi, and Luis, he just stood there. He let her. The sting of that betrayal was still fresh, more painful than the accusation itself. "This is going to be a mushroom cloud, you know that," she warned gently. "Are you ready for that?" "I'm not the one who planted the bomb," I said. "I'm just flipping the switch." After I hung up with Violet, I sent a text to my younger sister, Quinn. She's 29, fiercely protective, and works as a paralegal, which has made her exceptionally good at digging up things people want to keep hidden. "It's on, phase 2. Her reply came back almost instantly. "Sending you what I found. Call me." I opened the file she emailed me. It was a scanned copy of a hospital birth record from the county archives. Luis Delgado, born March 12, 1988. Mother, Regina Delgado. Father, Kenneth Delgado. It all looked official. But Quinn had highlighted a small notation at the bottom, a record of amendment filed 6 weeks after the original certificate. It was a legal, if uncommon, procedure. But why would a birth certificate need to be amended? I called her. What am I looking at? I had to pull some strings to get the original filing record, Quinn said, her voice buzzing with energy. The amendment was to add Kenneth's name to the father's line. The original certificate left that field blank. My blood ran cold. Blank? Completely blank, Angie, like the father was unknown. Or, at least, unlisted. I leaned against the cool marble of the bathroom counter, my reflection staring back at me. A woman who looked calm, composed, but whose world was tilting on its axis. Regina hadn't just hidden a pregnancy, she had lied on a legal document. She had built her son's entire identity on a foundation that was starting to crumble, and I had my hand on the detonator. A week after the party, a small, discreet cardboard box arrived. It sat on the polished mahogany table in the grand foyer, an unassuming Trojan horse in the heart of the Delgado estate. Inside were 5 DNA test kits, each sealed in sterile plastic. Their presence sucked the air out of the room. Regina breezed past the table, pausing just long enough to glance at the box. "Well, isn't this modern?" she said, a tight, dismissive smile on her face, getting to the truth with a bit of spit. How very efficient. She was trying to project confidence, but I saw the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted a vase of lilies. She still thought the only secret at risk was mine. Kenneth was a ghost. He moved through the house with a heavy, deliberate silence, his eyes fixed on some distant point over my shoulder. He wouldn't look at me, at Luis, or at the box. He was a man waiting for a sentence to be read. Luis, on the other hand, was desperate to pretend none of this was happening. "Can we just get this over with, Ang?" he'd asked me the night before. "Humiliate, Mum, prove your point, and let's move on." He didn't understand this was never just about proving a point. It was about razing a rotten structure to the ground. The next day, I made an appointment with Dave Walker, the family lawyer and Luis's godfather. My excuse was perfectly reasonable. I wanted to discuss setting up a trust for Isabella and clarifying her inheritance rights, given the unfortunate questions that had been raised about her paternity. Dave's office was old-world luxury, leather chairs, dark wood, the faint smell of paper and scotch. He was a man in his early 60s, with a kind face that didn't quite reach his shrewd eyes. He'd known the Delgados for 40 years. "Angela, this whole situation is a shame," he began, settling into his chair. "A family squabble that's gone too far." "I agree," I said smoothly, "which is why I want to make sure Isabella is protected, legally, no ambiguities." I leaned forward slightly. "I used to work as a researcher at a law firm before Isabella was born. I know how important ironclad documentation is, especially with complex family estates." I let that hang in the air. It was a subtle reminder that I wasn't just some emotional daughter-in-law. I knew how to read the fine print. "Of course," Dave said, a little too quickly. "Isabella is Luis's heir, there's no question." "But what if there was?" I pressed gently. "Hypothetically, say, if a birth certificate had been amended after the fact, could that create complications down the line?" The colour drained from Dave Walker's face. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible shift, but I saw it. He knew. He cleared his throat, shuffled some papers on his desk, and suddenly became very busy. "That's a highly unusual and specific hypothetical, Angela. I can assure you the Delgado family records are all in perfect order." His denial was all the confirmation I needed. He was a part of it. That night, I went back to my own investigation. The attic had become my sanctuary of secrets. I pulled out the old photo albums again, this time looking for faces that weren't Delgados. And there he was, in picture after picture from Regina's college years, Wyatt Gardner. Wyatt was 59 now, our quiet, brooding neighbour who lived in the house his parents had owned for decades. He was a family friend, always present at holidays, always on the periphery. In the old photos he was young, intense, and always standing next to Regina. They weren't just friends. The way he looked at her, the way her hand rested on his arm, it was obvious. I found Regina's college yearbook tucked into a box of old report cards. I flipped through the pages, past the smiling faces and cheesy club photos, until I found her portrait. Underneath, in the section for personal messages, was a scrawled inscription. Regina, my love for you is the one thing that will never change. No matter what happens or where we end up, remember that. Always. W.G. W.G. Wyatt Gardner. They had been in love. Deeply, it seemed. And this was just before she abruptly dropped out of school and married Kenneth Delgado, a man 4 years her senior, whom she barely seemed to know in the photos from the year before. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The blank space on the birth certificate, the rushed marriage, the lifelong silent presence of the man next door. This wasn't just about a lie. This was about a whole other life that had been erased, and I was about to write it back into existence. The day we collected the samples was a masterclass in silent warfare. We gathered in the formal living room, the 5 test kits laid out on the coffee table like instruments for a surgery. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of plastic packaging and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I watched as each of them swabbed the inside of their cheek, Regina with a flourish of defiance, Kenneth with a grim mechanical motion, and Luis with the resigned air of a man walking to his own execution. I sealed each sample bag myself, the plastic crinkling under my fingers, and placed them in the prepaid mailer. The blood, so to speak, was in the ink. Later that evening, Luis found me in the library. He closed the heavy oak doors behind him, shutting out the rest of the house. "Are you happy now?" he asked, his voice low and strained. He wouldn't look at me, instead focusing on a row of leather-bound books. "Was this worth it, tearing everything apart just to humiliate my mother?" "Your mother accused me of infidelity in front of 30 people," I reminded him calmly. "She questioned the legitimacy of our daughter. This is not a game I started, Luis. I'm just playing the hand I was dealt." "You could have just said no." "You could have let it go." "And let her win?" I finally asked, my voice dropping. "Let her plant that seed of doubt in everyone's mind, including yours. Is that what you wanted?" He had no answer for that. He just stood there, a man caught between 2 warring countries belonging to neither. I didn't tell him that his mother's humiliation was merely collateral damage, a bonus, not the objective. With the samples mailed off, a tense 2-week waiting period began. I used the time to make one last trip to the attic. I felt like a detective returning to the scene of the crime, searching for the one clue everyone else had missed. I went through a trunk of Regina's things from college, old textbooks, faded sorority shirts, and a small locked wooden box. It wasn't hard to pick the cheap lock. Inside, nestled amongst dried corsages and ticket stubs, was a stack of letters. Most were from friends, but a handful were different. They were drafts, written in Regina's elegant cursive, full of crossed-out words and tear stains that had warped the paper. They were all addressed to Wyatt. The last one, dated just 2 months before her wedding to Kenneth, was the one that stopped my breath. "Wyatt," it began. "I don't know how to say this. My parents know. They found out everything. They say I've brought shame on this family and that there is only one way to fix it. They have arranged for me to marry Kenneth Delgado. He knows, and he has agreed to raise the child as his own. They are taking me out of school. They say I can never see you again. Please don't try to contact me. They'll only make it worse. I'm so sorry. I will love you forever. But I have to do this. For our baby." It was all there. A forced marriage, a secret pregnancy, a lifetime of lies, all spelled out on faded stationery. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steady, despite the tremor in my chest. This was the motive. The DNA would be the weapon. That night, Quinn called. "Okay, you are not going to believe this," she said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "So, Wyatt Gardner doesn't have a public profile on any of the big DNA sites. He's a ghost, but his second cousin on his mother's side does. I found her through a genealogy forum. She's super into family history and has her results public to find relatives." "And?" I asked, my heart pounding, and I ran the markers. Using the public data from his cousin, you can trace certain unique genetic sequences that are passed down through that specific family line. It's not 100% definitive without a direct sample from Wyatt, but Angie, the probability that Luis shares those same rare markers is astronomical. We're talking statistically impossible for it to be a coincidence. He's a Gardner, not a Delgado. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place, they were welded together. 2 weeks after we sent the kits, my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a California area code. "Hello, may I speak with Angela Delgado?" a professional, serious voice asked. "This is she. My name is Dr. Evans. I'm the lab director for the genetic testing facility. I'm calling about the results for the samples submitted under your name." He paused. "We've flagged some significant inconsistencies in the results that we need to discuss with you before we can release the official report. Would you be available to come in and speak with me in person?" The lab was a sterile, white-walled office 20 miles from the suffocating perfection of the Delgado estate. I sat across a sleek metal desk from Dr. Evans, a man with tired eyes and an impeccably calm demeanour. He slid a folder across the desk towards me. "As the primary contact on the account, we are obligated to discuss these findings with you first," he said, his voice neutral. "Typically, results are straightforward. In this case, they are not." I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, my expression carefully composed. "I see." He opened the folder, revealing 2 separate reports. "Let's start with the simple one, the paternity test for Isabella Delgado. The results are conclusive. The probability of paternity for Luis Delgado is 99.9999%. He is, without any scientific doubt, her biological father." I nodded slowly, letting out a small measured breath. Vindication. It felt less like a victory and more like the cold click of a lock falling into place. "And the other results?" Dr. Evans slid the second report forward. "This is where the inconsistency arises. As part of the family analysis, we compared the DNA of all participants. Based on the samples provided, Luis Delgado and Kenneth Delgado do not share the necessary allelic markers to indicate a parent-child relationship. They are not biologically related." There it was. The truth, printed in black and white, stripped of all emotion and distilled into pure data. I had known it, deep in my bones, for months, but seeing it confirmed on official letterhead sent a chill through me. I was armed now. The war was about to begin. "Thank you, Doctor," I said, my voice even. "I appreciate your discretion. Please hold the official release of the reports. I will let you know when to send them." He looked at me, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, in his eyes. "Of course. This is sensitive information." That evening, at a family dinner that felt more like a wake, I put on the performance of my life. I picked at my food, my gaze fixed on my plate. I let my shoulders slump. When Luis tried to make small talk, I gave him a weak, distracted smile. I was the very picture of a woman consumed by anxiety. Regina watched me from across the table, a vulture circling its prey. She was enjoying this far too much. "You look pale, dear," she said, her voice laced with false concern. "Stressing over those silly tests, are we? I'm sure it will all be fine." "I just want this to be over," I murmured, looking up with what I hoped were convincingly worried eyes. The waiting is awful." "Well, it shouldn't be much longer," she announced, placing her wine glass down with a decisive click. She saw her opening and seized it. "I think, to put an end to all this nonsense, we should open the results together. As a family, this Sunday, we'll have brunch, read the papers, and move on as a united front." Kenneth's fork clattered against his plate. Luis just stared at his mother, his expression unreadable. "That sounds fair," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was perfect. She thought this was her stage, her moment of triumph where she would either expose me or magnify my humiliation before graciously forgiving me. Later that night, as I was taking the recycling bin to the curb, a figure emerged from the shadows of the driveway next door. It was Wyatt Gardner. He was holding a gardening tool, but he wasn't gardening. He was just standing there, watching my house. He walked towards me slowly, stopping at the edge of his lawn. "Angela," he said, his voice rough, I heard about what's going on. The tests." The neighbourhood was small. Gossip travelled fast. "It's a family matter, Wyatt," I said politely. He looked down at the ground, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a sorrow so old it seemed etched into his face. "Sometimes," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "people make choices when they're young, choices they're forced into, and they have to live with them forever. Sometimes a man can have a child out there and never be allowed to know him." He was confessing, not to me, but to the universe, to the decades of silence. He was hoping for a reaction, for absolution, for something. I gave him nothing. I just looked at him, held his gaze for a long moment, and let a small, knowing smile touch my lips. Then I turned and walked back inside, leaving him alone in the dark. Sunday brunch at the Delgado estate was a sacred ritual. Normally, it was a lavish affair with mimosas and carefully curated conversation. Today, it was a tribunal. A platter of untouched croissants sat in the centre of the dining table. The only liquid being poured was ice water. Regina was at the head of the table, radiating a smug, regal authority. Kenneth sat to her right, a statue carved from granite. Luis was beside me, fidgeting with his napkin, his anxiety a palpable hum in the air. I, for my part, kept my hands clasped in my lap, feigning a nervousness I did not feel. Just as Regina was about to speak, the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," I said, standing up. A moment later, I returned with Wyatt Gardner in tow. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room, landing on everyone but Regina. "Wyatt?" Luis asked, confused. "What are you doing here?" "I asked him to join us," I said calmly, returning to my seat. "Since this is about family transparency, I thought it was important for a lifelong family friend to be present." Regina's eyes narrowed. She shot a venomous look at Wyatt, who refused to meet her gaze. The trap was now fully set. "Fine," Regina snapped, turning her attention back to me. "Let's get on with this farce. Where are the results?" I placed a simple manila folder on the table. "The lab emailed the official reports this morning. I printed copies for everyone." I slid 4 sealed envelopes across the polished wood. One for Regina, one for Kenneth, one for Luis, and one for me. "Let's start with the reason we're all here, shall we?" I said, my voice clear and steady. I opened my envelope and pulled out the first page. "This is the paternity analysis for Isabella Delgado." I looked directly at Regina, whose smirk was unwavering. She thought she knew what was coming. "It reads, the alleged father, Luis Delgado, is not excluded as the biological father of the child, Isabella Delgado. The probability of paternity is 99.999%. I placed the paper down flat on the table. Isabella is Luis's daughter. The silence was absolute. Regina's face went slack, her smugness evaporating into stunned disbelief. Luis let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for weeks, a wave of pure relief washing over him. He reached for my hand under the table, but I didn't take it. We weren't done. "Well," I said into the quiet. "That settles that. But as I said at the party, this was about full transparency. And the family analysis report raised a few other interesting points." I pulled a second sheet of paper from my envelope. "This one compares the DNA between Louise and Kenneth." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "According to this report, they share no biological link. Louise, you are not Kenneth's son." Every head whipped towards Regina. Her face, which had been pale with shock, was now ashen. Kenneth didn't flinch. He just stared at his wife, his expression one of profound, weary disappointment. He had known all along. "That's a lie!" Regina shrieked, finding her voice. "You faked it! You forged these documents to destroy me!" "Did I?" I asked softly. I reached into my folder again and pulled out a photocopy of a faded, handwritten letter. I slid it across the table to Louise. "I found this in your mother's memory box in the attic. It's a letter she wrote to Wyatt, dated 2 months before she married Kenneth." Louise picked it up, his hands trembling as he read. I watched his face crumble as he absorbed the words. "She writes," I recited from memory, my voice devoid of emotion. "He knows, and he has agreed to raise the child as his own. I have to do this, for our baby." "You venomous little snake," Regina hissed, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "The lab only tells you who isn't a match," I continued, ignoring her. "But with a little research, it's not hard to find who is." I pulled out the final document from my folder. It was the report Quinn had helped me compile, showing the undeniable genetic markers linking Louise's DNA to Wyatt's family line. I placed it on the table. "This is a familial match report, cross-referenced from public genealogy databases. It shows a statistical certainty that Luis shares his paternal lineage not with the Delgados." I looked up, my eyes locking with Wyatt's for the first time. "But with the Gardners." The room imploded. Louis stared at the paper, then at Wyatt, then at the woman he had called his mother his entire life. The betrayal, the confusion, the sheer magnitude of the lie twisted his face into a mask of agony. "You," he whispered, his voice choked. He stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. He pointed a shaking finger at Regina, his whole body trembling. "You lied to me! My entire life is a lie!" he roared, his voice finally breaking free in a wave of pure, unrestrained fury. The explosion of Luis's voice shattered the last remnants of the Delgado family's pristine facade. Chaos erupted. Regina stumbled to her feet, her hands outstretched towards her son. "Luis, please, let me explain. It wasn't like that." "Not like what?" he yelled, his face contorted with a pain so raw it was difficult to watch. "You lied to me every single day for 34 years. You let me believe I was someone I'm not." Kenneth finally moved. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements heavy with a resignation that spoke of decades of silent compliance. He walked over to Regina, his expression unreadable. "Was it worth it, Regina?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a collapsing mountain. "All this? Was any of it worth this?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the dining room, out of the house, and out of the life he had so carefully constructed. Wyatt sat frozen in his chair, a man caught in the wreckage of a past he was never allowed to claim. He looked at Louise, his eyes filled with a lifetime of unspoken longing and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? Regina finally broke. The iron mask of her pride shattered, and she crumpled, sobbing. "My family," she choked out, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate last-ditch confession. "My parents were very powerful, very proud. They said I had ruined my life, that I would bring shame on them. They made the arrangements. Kenneth's family needed a business merger. My family needed to hide a scandal. It was a transaction." She looked at Louise, her eyes pleading. They made me promise to never speak of it again, to never see Wyatt again. Dave Walker drew up the legal agreements. He was the only other one who knew. I did it to protect you, Louise. To give you a good life, a name. A name? Louise laughed, a bitter, broken sound. You gave me a lie. You didn't protect me. You protected yourself. He turned his back on her, his shoulders heaving. Regina reached for him, but he flinched away as if her touch were acid. Defeated, she sank back into her chair, a queen dethroned in her own castle, weeping amongst the ruins. Throughout it all, I said nothing. I just sat there, a silent observer at the demolition I had engineered. My heart wasn't pounding. I felt no thrill of victory, no savage joy, just a cold, hollow emptiness. The revenge was complete. The truth was out. And it was every bit as devastating as I had imagined. Slowly, Louis turned his head and looked at me. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrifying clarity. The pieces were connecting for him now. My calm demeanour at the party, my insistence on a family-wide test, my conversation with Dave, my inviting Wyatt here today. He saw the intricate web I had woven. "You knew," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've known for weeks, haven't you?" I didn't deny it. I met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time since this all began. He saw not the wronged wife, but the architect of his family's destruction. The shock on his face curdled into a new kind of betrayal, one that was colder and deeper than his mother's lies. "This was all planned," he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Every step. You set her up. You set us all up." He took a step towards me, his voice dropping to a raw, wounded whisper that cut me more than his shouting ever could. "Was this really about our daughter, Angela? Was any of this about protecting Isabella? Or was this just about you proving a point?" Louise's question hung in the ruined atmosphere of the dining room, a final, devastating blow. He wasn't looking for an answer. He was delivering a verdict. The hours that followed were a blur of quiet, devastating departures. Kenneth returned only to pack a single suitcase, his face a mask of grim resolve. He didn't speak to Regina. He didn't even look at her. He simply walked out the door, and we all knew he wasn't coming back. Regina, stripped of her husband, her son, and her dignity, was gone by nightfall, collected by a bewildered-looking friend. Wyatt vanished sometime during the initial chaos, a ghost returning to his haunting. Louise and I were left alone in the cavernous, silent house. He didn't yell or argue. He just looked at me with the eyes of a stranger. "I'm going to a hotel," he said, his voice flat and empty. "I need space." He packed a bag and left, the click of the front door echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. I learned that week that power doesn't come from yelling. It doesn't come from throwing things or making threats. Real power is in the calm, calculated delivery of a truth so undeniable it shatters the world of the person who hears it. I had wielded that power, and now I was the queen of a silent, empty kingdom. A few days later, I was having coffee with Violet in my kitchen. The house felt too big, the silence too loud. "Kenneth filed for divorce," I told her, tracing the rim of my mug. "Louise started seeing a therapist. He calls to check on Isabella, but he won't talk to me about anything else." Violet watched me, her expression a mixture of support and deep concern. "You got what you wanted, Angie," she said softly. "You exposed her. You were vindicated. Are you happy?" I considered the question. Was I happy? "Happy isn't the right word," I said. "I feel level. The board has been cleared. The lies are gone." "But what's left?" she pressed gently. "You seem harder. Like you built a fortress around yourself, and now you can't find the door out." She was right. The fire of my anger had burned so brightly it had forged something new inside me, something colder and stronger, and I wasn't sure I liked it. I wondered if revenge had made me hollow. The year that followed was one of quiet dismantling. Lawyers came and went. The house was put up for sale. Louise and I began the slow, painful process of separating our lives, communicating only through brief, sterile text messages about Isabella. Isabella's second birthday arrived on a cool, overcast afternoon. The party was nothing like the year before. There was no sprawling estate, no dozens of guests. It was just me, my sister Quinn, and Violet in my small new apartment. We had a simple store-bought cake with 2 candles on it. Just as I was about to light them, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Luis. He looked tired, but healthier than he had a year ago. He held a clumsily wrapped gift in his hands. "I didn't want to miss it," he said, his eyes on our daughter, who was clapping her hands excitedly at the sight of the cake. He stayed for an hour. The conversation was stilted, but it wasn't hostile. It was the careful, polite talk of 2 people who had once shared a life and were now navigating a fragile truce. As he was leaving, another knock came. It was Wyatt. He didn't try to come in. He just stood in the hallway, holding a thick envelope. "This is for Luis," he said, his voice quiet. "It's not an excuse. It's just the truth, my side of it. He can read it or throw it away. It's his choice." He handed it to me and left. I passed the letter to Luis. He took it, his expression unreadable, and left without another word. That night, after Isabella was asleep, I stood by my window looking out at the city lights. Some secrets rot the people who keep them, and some truths. They burn the whole house down. I had stood in the ashes, and I was still standing. I didn't ruin this family. Their lies did. I just turned on the lights.